we've got to discuss some logistical matter. There is a course website. On the course website, we have posted, in addition to the course description and syllabus, all of the readings that are not contained in the assigned books. So the readings are either in the assigned books or posted on the course syllabus. And the course syllabus is an important instrument of engagement in the course. And we will, from time to time, post additional materials and notices. All of the classes will be videotaped, and a tape of the class will be posted 2 or 3 days after each class on the course website. So there's no need to take detailed notes if taking detailed notes prejudices your focus in class, which is more important. We have students here from different schools and different moments in their education. Any undergraduates in the course will be expected to participate in a weekly discussion section. And I wanted to introduce now the teaching assistant, Sasha Gonchov.
Sasha.
And he will be in touch with the undergraduates and organize a weekly discussion section. We have another partner in this course, Michael Pewitt. Michael is unable to be with us in the initial weeks of the course because of a prior engagement, so he will join us later on in time for our discussion of ancient Chinese and Indian thought. So I think those are the basic logistical matters. My office is next door in this neoclassical building here is called Langdell. The west wing is called Arida, and my office is 226 in Arida, and my office hours are on Fridays from 2 to 4. Anything else, Cornell?
I think you've covered it. My office at Andover Hall at the Divinity School. It's on the 3rd floor, and I'm there usually Tuesdays, even though you must contact a sister named Kristen Gunst, G-U-N-S-T. G-U-N-S-T. She sets up all of the appointments, though, on Tuesdays. Usually it's Tuesdays. It goes from 12 until ... It just goes.
So any practical questions about our arrangements for the course before we begin? In general, our procedure here will be that both of us will be present in all of the classes. Both of us will speak in each of the classes. One of us will begin, the other will respond. There'll be discussion between us, but it is our firm intention to reserve a major part of the class, of each class, for general discussion with all of you. The subject matter could hardly be more difficult.
That's true.
It's a subject matter for which there exists no established disciplinary background. And as will become clear, even in this first class, we are determined to advance to the frontier of the almost unspeakable and the almost unthinkable. And this attitude of ours requires from you a disposition to engage and above all, patience. You know, the philosopher Wittgenstein once said, when one philosopher greets another, his greeting should be, take your time. That is an indispensable requirement for an effort like this one. If you're impatient for a system, for clarity, for a clear route, this is not the place to be. We're dealing with subjects that resist the attempt of the mind to dominate and make everything transparent. Nevertheless, we will conduct a struggle to achieve a minimal degree of light. So shall we begin, or are there any other questions? Anything more you want to say, Cornell?
No, I just want to say that I'm blessed to be here, and I look forward to each and every one of us unsettling each other. And anytime I get a chance to be in a context where I am unsettled and I get a chance to unsettle my dear Professor Unger, that I met him over 40 years ago. He was in his mid-20s, and he was already the wunderkind. He was already the young philosopher who was trying to hold on to traditions that had everything to do with what this class is about: concrete lived experience, praxis against the status quo. And here he is now, still so-and-so years young, and we've had a chance to teach on American democracy, but we have never had a chance to teach this course on the conduct of life, where these deep existential issues come at us. And so just to be able to live long enough to be in conversation with my dear brother Unger on these kind of issues brings unadulterated joy to my heart. And that's why I'm on fire about this class. I'm telling you. So we can just begin. You see, he's written some wonderful things on the board.
So these charts that I've written on the board are meant to assist us in the discussion of these first two classes. Everything that we touch on today will come back to next week and in subsequent weeks. So today is just a first approach. The subject matter of this course, the theme, is the basic orientations to existence that are available to us. And it will very soon become apparent that this subject matter is decisively not the subject matter of most of academic moral philosophy. Most academic moral philosophy is concerned with what in this chart is labeled meta-ethics. Certain methods of justification or argument, as opposed to what you could describe as first-order projects. What to do. How to begin approaching the question, what should I do with my life? Now, we're not going to address that question directly in the circumstance of each individual. We're going to address the basic sets of ideas that are available to us in the history of our civilization with which to engage that question. And there is a long list of contrasts that arise when we begin to think in that way, which is, I again insist, not the way of academic moral philosophy. For example, which of these two principles should we generally adopt in our lives? Should we act according to the maxim common to a great deal of world philosophy, stay out of trouble? Or should we instead embrace the principle that has been defended in the history of modern thought? Look for trouble. And there are a whole series of divisions, of contrasts of view like that one, that are decisive for our orientation to existence. Now, in the first part of today's class, before we begin to deal with the content, the first order projects and how they differ from meta-ethics, we want to say something about the mode of discourse, the language, the way of thinking in which our agenda can be addressed. We imagine that there's a space, an intellectual space, that crosses the division between what we conventionally call religion and what we know as philosophy. So it's not like religion in the sense that it's not about some particular narrative of salvation focused on the interaction between the human and the divine. But it's also not like what a great deal of philosophy has been in the history of world thought. Until very recently, philosophy could be described as a kind of super science in the service of self-help. So the idea of the philosophers was there's a queen of the sciences, a foundational discipline, towering over all the specialized forms of knowledge and revealing the ultimate character of reality. And this supposed super science is mainly enlisted in the service of a form of self-help. It has been, to a very large extent, a way of casting a spell on ourselves so that we can assuage our anxiety, our fright, with respect to some of the basic problems of existence, beginning with our mortality. Now this idea of philosophy as a super science in the service of self-help, in much of the world, in the academy of much of the world, has been cast aside in favor of a diminished and degraded conception of philosophy as a kind of thought police in which the residual task of philosophy is to police the form of argument and determine what counts as a good argument or a bad argument in different fields of knowledge. And it turns out that, in general, humanity is not very interested in hiring this thought police. So it's marginalized and not taken seriously outside of its own world. So what then is the form of discourse with which we can engage the problems that we propose to you? This discourse about fundamental orientations to existence, what are its distinguishing attributes? In this first chart here, I've suggested some of these attributes, just to locate the form of discourse that we're going to attempt to develop here. Now, the first attribute is that this is a form of discourse that responds to the irreparable flaws in the human condition. Now, what are these flaws? First, our mortality, that we will die. So the experience of life is an experience of an indefinite fecundity. one of the most important attributes of the human being, individually and collectively, the human race, is that there is always more in us, in each of us individually, and in all of us collectively, humanity, than there is or ever can be in the social and conceptual worlds that we build and inhabit. They are finite with relation to us, and we are infinite with relation to them. We transcend them. We spill over. This is this experience of life with its characteristics of surfeit, spontaneity, and surprise, transcending structure. But in response to this experience that we have of our fecundity, nature decrees our death, our annihilation. And this is the first irreparable flaw in the human condition. The second flaw is the flaw that I call here our groundlessness. We are unable definitively to grasp the ultimate framework of our existence. And therefore, our lives, when we pause to reflect on them, have a vertiginous and dreamlike character. Everything that we think or do is based on presuppositions, but in trying to go further down, we never reach the bedrock, the ultimate envelope or framework of these presuppositions. And as a result, all of our existence has this enigmatic and dreamlike character. The third irreparable flaw in the human condition is our insatiability. We human beings want the unlimited. But everything that surrounds us is limited. And so our characteristic predicament is to seek the unlimited from the limited. That's what we do. Our desires, all of our desires and aspirations, have an indefinite and roving quality, and then we fix on some paltry proxy for the unlimited, the absolute, the unconditional. And in our relations to one another, even in the most intense relations of mutual recognition and love, we seem to want from the other something that the other is never able definitively to give, which is an assurance that each of us has an unconditional place in the world. Now, there's a fourth feature of this situation, which might not be regarded as irreparable. And that is our susceptibility to belittlement. We have this experience of fecundity, of transcendence, but the ordinary experience of human existence is an experience of constraint and humiliation, which it would be the task of politics to modify, if not to overcome. But it is ordinarily a part of this human experience that we find it difficult to live as who we imagine ourselves to be, like Hamlet. And thus, our existence is tainted throughout by this experience of suppression, of frustration, of containment, of denial of our true characters. So thought about the orientation to existence is serious to the extent that it addresses openly and courageously these irreparable flaws in the human condition, rather than representing some kind of lullaby or some, what I called it with respect to this classical practice of philosophy, a spell that we try to cast on ourselves. Now, the second attribute of this form of discourse is that it anchors an existential imperative, that is to say, an orientation to live, to life, a way of living, an answer to the question, how should I live, in a vision of reality. Even if the vision of reality renounces the pretense of classical philosophy of being a foundational superscience and accepts as part of the reality of the circumstance this enigmatic character of our existence. There's an intimate relation, a dialectic, between the vision of reality and the existential imperative. And that then suggests a third characteristic of this form of discourse, which is that it claims to cross a divide that is often thought to be insuperable, which is the divide between the is and the ought, between the descriptive or the explanatory on one side and the prescriptive or the normative on the other side. Now, you know that in the history of European philosophy, the canonical source of this idea of an insuperable division between the is and the ought is the philosophy of David Hume, the English philosopher Hume. That you cannot infer ought arguments from is arguments. But it's strange because it seems that in Hume's philosophy itself, a vision of how to live is anchored in a conception of who we are. How are we to think of this division between the is and the ought? It seems that the division between the is and the ought applies only to the extent that our thought is relatively local or specialized or superficial. But as our thinking about ourselves becomes comprehensive, as it must be in this form of discourse, the division between the is and the ought stops making sense. The more comprehensive our thinking is about our situation, the harder it becomes to insist on this division between the is and the ought. The fourth characteristic of this form of discourse is that it requires and arouses faith in two distinct but related senses. The first sense is that it entangles us in a series of reflections and decisions for which it seems we can never have grounds that are adequate enough. So with respect to these basic orientations to existence, we're going to struggle here to claim that we can say something about them. We can have arguments in favor or against certain orientations to existence. But it seems that these arguments are never conclusive, that they are always inconclusive. And one of the several ways in which they are inconclusive is that they all have the character of being a self-fulfilling prophecy. So a vision of human existence says to each of us, believe in me and act as if I were true. And by believing in me and acting as if I were true, you will make me true. That's the self-fulfilling prophecy. But then life, reality fights back and fails completely to surrender to the self-fulfilling prophecy. So the self-fulfilling prophecy may not work or may work imperfectly. And the lessons of experience in defiance of the self-fulfilling prophecy may be ambiguous. So the fundamental problem of faith in this first sense is that we cannot escape deciding. We have to orient our existence in one direction or another. But the grounds that we have to orient it in one direction or another never seem to be good enough. They're never conclusive. They're never decisive. The result is that the most important question is the question for which we never have the adequate answer. It's not that we can't think and argue. We can. But the arguments never close the circle. And that gap, that disproportion between the faithful weight of the commitment and the inadequacy of the grounds for it is then the first sense of faith. But that first sense of faith leads then to a second derivative sense of faith. We have to act. We have to commit our lives in one direction or another without having ever adequate grounds. And required as we are to commit and to engage without adequate grounds, we put ourselves in the hands of other people. The inadequacy of our grounds makes us more vulnerable to them. And so our engagement requires us to accept a heightened vulnerability to the other people. This is the second sense of faith. Faith is trust. We will engage. We will engage without having adequate grounds. As a result, we'll become more vulnerable to the others, and we hope that they won't destroy us as we cast down our shields. So this is just an initial evocation of the form of discourse, the characteristics of the form of discourse in which we will attempt during the semester to address these different orientations to existence. And of course, we hope that we will refine and deepen our ideas about the discourse as we develop it. Now, before going on, why don't you speak to that?
Absolutely. Well, another way of saying something very, very similar to what my dear brother's just put forward. He's talked about inescapable mortality. He's talked about the insatiability of our desires. He's talked about the belittlement that we all feel that can be elevated under certain conditions so that it's changeable, but it's something that is persistent in the human condition. And he's talked about the groundlessness of our Weltanschauungs, of our worldviews. It could be Christian, Muslim, Jewish, secular, atheistic, agnostic, all the different streams and strands that constitute those traditions. In the end, they still fall short. So groundlessness is not sophomoric relativism, but it is a fallibilism. It is an inability to come up with the definitive perspective. Now, I want to build on that and make a very, very important distinction between the catastrophic and the problematic. And what I mean by that is that the existential and experiential orientations to human existence, as opposed to the more theoretical and conceptual forms, or put it in very crude language, Socratic and prophetic on one side, existential, experiential, scholastic and academic on the other side, abstract, distantiating, and conceptual. Now, in the end, of course, we can learn from each one of those modes, But this is a very fundamental distinction. Why? Because you'll find that in the scholastic and in the academic forms, there tends to be a denial of the catastrophic and an obsession with the narrowly problematic. What are you saying? Well, let's look at it in very concrete terms regarding where we are now. So much of the future of U.S. democracy depends on the catastrophic realities that informs its past and present. Crisis of empire, crisis of capitalism, crisis of misogyny, crisis of white supremacy, crisis of transphobia, crisis of homophobia. Now go to philosophy department and see whether you can get subject matter that deals with any of those catastrophes. What do you got to say about the crisis of highly financialized capitalism, with 1% of the population own 42% of the wealth, in which the top 3 individuals have wealth equivalent to the bottom 50% of fellow citizens, 160 million people? Well, we've got some utilitarian tools here that we're trying to... What are you going to say about misogyny and and sex? And what are you going to say about white supremacy that you have fought a civil war over? Well, we've got a course over in the corner on philosophy and race. Got a little Du Bois. We read a little Simone de Beauvoir when we have time. I mean, we laugh to keep from crying. There's a wonderful moment in my dear sister's text, Danielle Allen's text on Cuz. She's reflecting on the plight and predicament of her cousin. And she writes a chapter in academic language, impersonal, distancing, abstract. Then she says, oh my God, I'm talking about my cousin. I've got to let go of this academic orientation. I'm going to go existential. I'm going to talk about I. I'm talking about my intimate relation. I, thou, not I, it, in Martin Buber's language. See? The way in which you get a distance from the catastrophic. Well, existentially, what Brother Unger's just put forward here, death is not a problem. It's a catastrophe. It's inevitable. You better come to terms with it one way or the other, or you will snap. You will crack. You better have some stories and myths and legends and narratives in place when your grandmother or daddy is in that coffin, or you're not going to be able to orient yourself to the next stage of your own pilgrimage. So it's true with despair. So it's true with disease. So it's true with profound disappointment and disillusionment. Those are catastrophic. Most of scholastic and academic philosophy is in denial of those. So what do? You run to Beethoven and Curtis Mayfield and Aretha, or Erykah Badu, or Kendrick Lamar, or Bruce Springsteen. You run to the artists, the musicians, the poets. You run to Dostoevsky. You run to Tolstoy. You run to Dickens. You run to George Eliot. Oh, line 607b5 of Plato's Apology, the traditional quarrel between the poets and the philosophers. The poets take on the catastrophic head on. The philosophers in their scholastic and academic modes. There's a wonderful book worth taking a look at by Pierre Hadot, the close friend of Michel Foucault, called Philosophy as a Way of Life, as opposed to philosophy as a mode of discourse. That's what Henry David Thoreau meant when he went to Walden and said, I notice there's philosophy professors, but no philosophers. What do you mean, Thoreau? Because to call yourself a philosopher is not just to reflect on and give a lecture on virtues. It is to live philosophically by embodying and enacting the virtues that you write about. It's not a profession. Philosophy is not something you have. It's something you are. It's your vocation. The fundamental distinction between the calling, the beruf, versus your career. But just something you do in order to make some cash to keep your loved ones alive, and so forth and so on. And teach a course in the conduct of life in a late capitalist moment in a highly professional managerial space like Harvard is a challenge. It's a paradox. Because within the very context where the co-optation often takes place, you've got to be critical of the co-optation. But as you are critical of the co-optation, you're always already in part co-opted, because we're in the very context in which the dominant orientation is going the other way. And this is very important to keep in mind. And when we make the distinction between the prophetic and when I make the prophetic, the Socratic and the prophetic versus the scholastic and the academic, it's not just a matter of the place. It's not just a matter of the place. Schopenhauer was wrestling with the Socratic and the prophetic, but he taught for a moment in the university. He decided to schedule his classes at the same time as Hegel's. Nobody showed up for his class. Hegel was overflowing, so he wasn't highly encouraged about the academy. But you can find prophetic and Socratic folk inside of the academy, but they're not the dominant voices. In fact, they're not the dominant voices at all. Most of the dominant voices are the echoes of the hegemonic discourses in the respective disciplines, given the reward structure of tenure and reward structure of awards and prizes and so on. You see. That's why usually when people invoke the Socratic and the prophetic at that deep existential level, you're talking about, I'll write some words up here. It's what Alcibiades said about Socrates in the Symposium. He's a topos. What is a topos? Unclassifiable, unsubsumable, strange, extravagant, absurd, uncanny. Like Gregor Samson in Kafka's classic short story, Metamorphosis. Uncanny. They don't fit. You know. Socrates describes himself in the Theaetetus. I think it's about line 149a. He says, I am topos. I go around injecting aporia in people. Deep perplexity. Hitting up against the limits of rationality, forcing people to come to terms with what the great Leopardi, the bleak Italian 19th century poet, called reason's sweet shipwreck. You start at the shipwreck. You start at the catastrophe in wrestling with the first order question, how to live. So it's no accident that usually, and I want to add this last one here because this is so important for Socrates, parrhesia, the fearless speech, the frank speech, the plain speech. Not deodorized, sanitized, sterilized speech, which is often the jargon of the academy, but the speech that gets right at the catastrophe, the genealogies of the catastrophes, that gets right at the depths of a crisis. It could be the crisis in your home, heart, mind, and soul. It could be the crisis of your community, or your family, of a civilization, or whatever. And of course, Socrates says what in line 24a of Plato's Apology? Parrhesia was the cause of my unpopularity. That's what got me killed. The plain speech, the frank speech, the unintimidated speech. And there's a connection between being unclassifiable and unsubsumable, refusing to fit in any narrow school of thought or ideology, perspective or vision. Being oneself on the one hand, but also acknowledging the ways in which you can't be yourself unless you acknowledge the variety of traditions that has gone into the shaping of you, what Antonio Gramsci called a critical historical self-inventory. Now, Socrates just called it self-examination, self-scrutiny, self-interrogation. But when you really contextualize, historicize, and pluralize it, you got all these different traditions going into the shaping of who you are. That's a mature form of piety. Your acknowledged dependence on the voices that were in place before you arrived. Just as the biological piety of the acknowledgement that you came through your mother's womb or stomach if she opted for cesarean section. Topos, aporia, parrhesia, the centrality of exemplarity. What it means to be tied to examples of arete, of excellence, examples of spiritual excellence and moral excellence. And Socrates, of course, was a certain kind of exemplar. And the very founding of modern philosophy had to do with his students saying, I'm going to make sure that every generation henceforth has to come to terms with the legacy of my teacher. That's Plato. And the very fact that we're talking about in 2018 means Plato triumphs. For a good reason. For a good reason, because the issues of what Brother Unger put up, Professor Unger put up here, has so much to do with what we see exemplified in a life lived. Not a life of purity, not a life that ought not to be criticized, but a life lived. And of course, this Socrates never wrote a word, so we depend on Plato and Xenophon and the others who wrote about this particular exemplar. But it's no accident we're going to see that exemplarity, when it comes to live lives, are pushed back in scholastic discourse and academic discourse. Now, Immanuel Kant is a very complicated figure. We'll say more about him. As much of his philosophical orientation, he's profoundly academic. But you look at his lectures on the Philosophic Encyclopedia where he says, lo and behold, we've lost the ancient understanding of philosophy tied to a lived life. We've become artists of reason rather than artists of living. Fascinating moment. Fascinating moment. What does it mean to be an artist of reason, concerned with puzzles, concerned with various logical problems that one tries to resolve solely by means of argumentation, as opposed to recognizing the limits of argumentation and the need for existential leaps, given the groundlessness. Rational argument still can take place, but in the end, you have to make a choice. You have to decide. You have to commit yourself. And to commit yourself is, as James Baldwin put it so eloquently, to put yourself in danger. We can say, I think, fairly surely that academic philosophy is not known for generating persons who put themselves in danger. It's distant, abstract context in which catastrophe is held at arm's length until that catastrophe comes to their house. Usually, in the U.S. Academy, there's one catastrophe that changes everything. War. Watch the nation go to war and see how the university becomes politicized overnight. Oh, we're impartial, we're detached, we have nothing to do with what the conclusions are. We're just interested in the quest. But let the nation be attacked, and all of a sudden, catastrophe intervenes. And all of a sudden, it's highly permissible, if not encouraged, for people to take a stand. Take a stand, but when it comes to ecological catastrophe, nuclear catastrophe, economic catastrophe, moral catastrophe, economic catastrophe, well, yes, we've got to deal with these problems. We'll get to it sooner or later. So when we talk about conduct of life, it's at the individual level, which is existential, interpersonal level, soul to soul, person to person, and then the structural and the institutional level. I've talked just a little bit about the Socratic legacy of Athens. We could talk about the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem. Famous. Jeremiah, Jesus, Muhammad, dealing with catastrophe, how to live. Not an algorithm, not a formula, but examples, lived examples. There's a wonderful line in Kant's critique of pure reason, the Norman Kent Smith translation. I think that's on about page 177. He says, examples are the go-kart of judgment. Examples are the go-kart of judgment. If you want to wrestle with the question of how to live and you're open to dealing with the catastrophes, not denying them, then you want to hang around some folk who've been wrestling with these catastrophes, who have tried to respond like Socrates in a self-critical way. Learn how to think for yourself. Or you hang around folk who try to internalize the sensibility of an Amos or a Jeremiah or an Esther or a Jesus or a Muhammad, which is a response of compassion, deep love, not just altruism. We're going to make that distinction. The ways in which love gets domesticated in terms of benevolence or altruism. No. We'll get a chance to talk about what's going on in Hebrew scripture. To justly love mercifully, walk humbly with thy God. You better spread that hesed to orphans and widows and fatherless and motherless, no matter what the consequences are. Learn how to give of yourself. Learn how to empty yourself. That Palestinian Jew on the cross, Muhammad trying to deal with all of the various different divisions and factions and giving of himself, willing to push to the edge of life's abyss in order to do what? In order to surrender in such a way that the service that is given might keep alive a legacy that they understand to be indispensable. They'll call it revelation, a number of different things. But it's said of a tradition of keeping alive. Just like you being again at the funeral of one of your parents. No matter what religious or non-religious orientation you have, you know one of your responses at its highest spiritual level is to allow the best of their life, their afterlife, to be at work in your life. That's a deep existential connection. Because they surrendered, they gave up themselves. They were kenotic in that sense. And also, Atapos, also wrestling with perplexity. And usually, they were very clear about what they told you in terms of how to live, whether you accepted it or not. So that's part of, I think, what we're going to be wrestling with when we talk about the conduct of life and ways in which we can be sensitive to some of the insights coming from the scholastic and academic thinkers, but most importantly, the deep existential and experiential thinkers that will be pushing us and challenging us and unsettling us in some joyful ways. I mean, I don't want this to be, let me put this on the top before I sit down. You got to find joy in Socratic self-criticism and joy in kenotic prophetic witness. And that has little to do with pleasure. I mean, we can talk about the way in which so much contemporary culture is a joyless quest for insatiable pleasure. And the joylessness in so many of the pleasures that are available, you see. But that's another day. So should we open it up?
Yeah, before we go on, because in the second part of today's class, the idea is that we would begin to introduce the substantive topic of the first order project. By contrast to the traditional subject matter of academic moral philosophy. But before we do that, let's ask
we can open it up.
if you have comments or questions about this problem of the nature of the discourse. Yes. Can you speak louder?
I have a question about a term used frequently
by adequate, persuasive, giving reasons that are proportional to the weight of the conclusion. So the claim of the orientation to exist, about an orientation to existence, is just about the most important decision that we could make. We engage the most important thing we have, which is our life, our existence. And the reference there is to what seems to be a disproportion between the weight of the decision and the force of the arguments or the ideas. It's not that we don't have arguments or ideas, is that the quality of the arguments and ideas, their persuasive force, their ability to ground or to justify, seems disproportionate to the weight of the commitment. That's the problem. Well, to say that it's subjective goes too far, because then we have this simple contrast between objectivity and subjectivity. We can make arguments, and arguments from experience. For example, we can say that a certain orientation to existence will be self-destabilizing. It tells us that if we act in a certain way, we will, for example, achieve serenity. And then we try it out, and it doesn't produce serenity. It makes us obsessional or cranks. So the experience belies the promise. That's a simple example of an argument that we make from experience. So the basic working assumption from which we're starting here is that we can make arguments about these orientations to existence. But the arguments never seem to be good enough in the sense of being proportionate to this fateful weight of the commitment of life in a particular direction.
Maybe another way of putting it is that the evidence in the end is underdetermined. So it can move in a variety of directions in regard to which interpretations you think are preferable, as opposed to other interpretations. Again, not relativistic, but highly contextual and fallibilistic. And if the evidence is always already underdetermined, which is usually the case when it comes to religions and so forth and so on, that the question becomes, well, what other elements does one fall back on in order to determine which tradition, which interpretation, which religious orientation or non-orientation one proceeds? Does God exist or not? Overwhelming evidence. Hell no. Some evidence. Maybe. One's own experience. Hell yes. How you going to deal with all these different levels? You read Dostoevsky, you said no, but he's a Christian. How did he end up? Well, you got to read the last section on the holy fools, right? But he's already given the most powerful arguments against the existence of God. Or David Hume's Dialogues of Natural Religion. No, and he holds on to the no. So that the evidence is underdetermined. It can go a variety of different directions in this way. And highly reasonable human beings can reach very starkly contrasting conclusions. Right? Some of the most intelligent people in the world are Muslims. Some of the most intelligent people in the world are atheists. Some of the most intelligent in the world are Christians. And all traditions have their ignoramuses.
But we're making a very particular claim. The claim is that with respect to these issues, there is always at the end of the day a gap, what you could call an epistemic gap, a gap between the urgency of the decision or the engagement and the fragility or the incompleteness of the arguments made on its behalf. So claim is that's not a feature of the way we're talking here. It's a feature of our situation.
Yeah.
And the, it doesn't serve as an exemption from the need to decide, because we can't not decide. We will decide in practice by the way we live, and we will decide in the characteristic situation of confusion, in which we act on assumptions that we don't reveal to ourselves. So the narrator in Proust says, "We are friends with those whose ideas are at the same level of confusion as our own." That's our general situation in the world. And we struggle to get beyond that. How far beyond that, we don't know. So this is why this kind of exercise has this character of approaching an uncertain limit. I said, the almost unspeakable, the almost unthinkable. We have a great interest in this topic. It's therefore astonishing that the topic should not be established in the academy. It's not a respectable topic. But how could one escape it? So in our culture generally, if we seek light about this outside religion, we go to literature, to art, where the narrative seems to be profound. We find a profound message, but it's not made explicit in the form of general ideas, of abstractions. That's the situation with which we're contending here.
I think that even a fuller picture has to do with the ways in which modern conditions has produced highly differentiated spheres. Science here, ethics here, the arts here, religion here, especially religion privatized. And when you're looking for serious wrestling, not definitive answers, but serious wrestling with these issues, you can go to the arts as the best examples. The mediocre examples is to go to the self-help department in bookstores. And the even less mediocre examples is just self-medication, addiction of various sorts, in order to come to terms with what it is to be human and at least feel titillated and stimulated and alive a bit before you put yourself back in professional managerial space. So that the kind of structural, institutional understanding of how difficult it is for this kind of delicate subject matter to be attended to. Because, I mean, we know education, well, this is what the Greeks meant by paideia, right? It's the formation of attention. How do they get you to attend to certain things? Well, Tim Wu tells us in his wonderful book on attention merchants that you've got marketeers who are trying to get your attention in a number of different ways. And one of the ways you get your attention is to stimulate and titillate or reinforce addictions to success, status, money, and so forth. So you never get a chance to attend to these deep existential issues, because in the end you're going to die, you're going to have disease, you're going to deal with dread, despair, disappointment, so forth and so on, you see. So what happens is it's very hard for the things that we think we should be attending to actually be a subject matter with which we can stay and linger, because our market-driven society pushes us in other directions. These weapons of mass distraction. To be distracted from what really matters. I don't have time. I don't have what it takes. I haven't cultivated the capacity for self-criticism, but I'm good at name-calling. I haven't really reinforced the capacity of self-surrender, but I'm good in self-indulgence. You see what I mean? That's an attempt to fill out a picture of the context in which we find ourselves.
Yes.
Within the silo that I function in, the so-called irreparable flaws in the human condition were addressed in the philosophies of Indo-Oriental thought as very much being correctable flaws. And in fact, it was that very purpose that drove people towards that philosophy, in that there is a way you can conquer insatiability. You can be satiated to the point of enlightenment, or reach, in some poetic sense, an immortality. So I'm not sure if the Indo-Oriental thought process would fit into this theological discourse if you indeed say that these are irreparable. In fact, the whole purpose or the drive behind Indian thought, as it once was, not anymore perhaps, was that you could
Undoubtedly. So let me refine my statement here of the mode of discourse. Its first attribute is it takes a position with respect to these apparently irreparable flaws in the human condition. The dominant philosophical and religious schools tell us, in effect, don't worry. They're not really irreparable. It's not just Indo-Oriental thought. It's the religions of the Bible also. They tell us, no, they're not what they seem to be. Death will be conquered. We're not as groundless as we appear to be. We can bring our desires to a resting point. So that certainly is a position, and the dominant position in the history of thought, West as well as East. It's not my position. So, but that's another matter. That's to discuss in the course of the semester. So for me, another stage in the history of our ideas would begin when we renounce the impulse to deny the reality of these flaws and to accept some story about how they're not real. We're not really going to die. We're not really insatiable. We're not really groundless, and so forth. That's a large part of the history of religion and philosophy. I would like to see humanity get beyond that and accept the reality of this condition and liberate itself nevertheless. But that's a great dispute. That's a central dispute now in the debates of humanity. But you're quite right to put your finger on that question. Now, maybe this is a good moment, Cornell, for me to introduce the topic of the First Order Project.
Sure. Unless there's just a burning last question.
Yes.
Is it burning? All right.
When you describe the structural hierarchy of academic disciplines, religion was placed towards the bottom, and you referred to it as privatized. How is it privatized, and why is it placed towards the bottom?
Well, one reason is that it had caused so much trouble in public life, leading towards such wars and ugly forms of atrocity and so forth. You wanted to lower the temperature. You wanted to privatize it in such a way that the kinds of enthusiasms associated with it in public life didn't lead toward crusades, Christians killing Jews, killing Muslims, and so forth and so on. At the same time, the subject matter of the religions, which has never been private, been holistic across the board. Across the board, what we understand public and private to be. The subject matter itself, especially within professional managerial sites in education. When the aim of an education is to produce managers and professionals, or in Harvard's case, produce major slices of the ruling class. The question is, what kind of education would be best fit for them? And there was a lot of conversation and dialogue, but within a certain kind of context. I mean, it's never been homogeneous or monolithic, but there's always been contours. There's always been limitations where it's difficult for certain voices to be heard, you see. We're going to see this with Emerson when he gives his divinity school address.
Allow me to make a comment about this because it's,
Yeah.
it's indirectly but powerfully
it's a good question.
related to the topic of our course.
Mm.
So you raised the question of the privatization of the spiritual, the privatization of religion. This is deeply paradoxical and puzzling. One of the most general characteristics of these world religions, the religions that arose in the world from the middle of the first millennium before Christ to the middle of the first millennium after Christ, from the rise of prophetic Judaism to the prophetic activity of Muhammad, including Buddhism and Confucianism in the East. One of the characteristics of religion is its demand to penetrate the whole of life, not to be cabined in any department of experience. Now, there was a deviation from this self-understanding of religion in some of the religions, and particularly since we are in the United States, in the middle period of the history of Protestantism, an acceptance of the privatization of religion. Religion is a matter of the individual conscience, not to infuse the public space. It was not characteristic of early Protestantism, of Luther and Calvin,
Right.
who
That's
had
right.
a view that demanded to penetrate all of social life, and it's not characteristic of recent Protestantism and its social teaching. It is characteristic of this middle period of the history of Protestantism, which is very important to understand the nature of American liberalism and its attitude to religion. Religion is privatized. It's a matter of individual conscience. And it's not something that you discuss in the public space, either of politics or of thought. Now, this is relevant to what we're doing because we are discussing it in the public space. Here, not of politics, but of thought. And we're not accepting this idea of the middle period of the history of Protestantism. These are profound problems to be hidden in the conscience of each individual, away from the public space. It's astonishing that this could ever have happened in the history of religion, because it's the opposite of religion. Religion always demanded to penetrate the whole of life. But it did happen in some of the religions, and particularly in Protestantism, and it was decisive for the attitude of Americans. So that's why they think that these issues are issues that you deal with in the secrecy of your private life. They're not issues. They're not issues for the agora. They're not issues for the public. For public thought, for public action. But it was never like that. This is a perversion. This is a heresy in the history of Christianity. And so, of course, our whole attitude here is against that. That's in response to your provocation. I want now in the second part of the class, with your help, to introduce this topic of the first order projects and their relation to what we understand as academic moral philosophy. And I'm going to refer to the academic moral philosophy, to what I'm calling the meta-ethics, very briefly, without entering into the content. The reading assignment for next week is the introductory chapter of a famous book by the philosopher Derek Parfit that deals with these schools of meta-ethics. And therefore, we will come back next week in much greater detail to this subject. All I want to do now is to introduce the field, the relation of meta-ethics to what I'm calling the first order projects. So academic moral philosophy, especially in the Anglo-American world, over the last several decades, has been largely concerned with a contest among certain higher order approaches to ethics, what I'm calling meta-ethics. What is the method of argument or of justification or decision. As opposed to first order projects, what do I do? How do I live my life? And the way that it is presented in the Anglo-American Academy is largely in the form of a contest among three major meta-ethical orientations. One of them is the utilitarian or consequentialist orientation, historically associated with utilitarianism with Bentham. And the simple formula for this view is serve the greatest good of the greatest number. Think of ethical life instrumentally as devoted to the promotion of the interests, of the welfare, of the happiness of the greatest number of people. A means-end schema. The second meta-ethical orientation is the Kantian or deontological. And its canonical, historical setting is Kant's moral philosophy, the so-called categorical imperative. Act according to a principle that you could will to be universal. So whatever rule you apply, be sure that it could apply universally. And it presents itself, therefore, as not instrumental, but deontological. It's a set of universal rules and principles with this content of, this essential content of universality. Then comes the third, the social contract, which has been reinterpreted by the Anglo-American political philosophers recently in their theories of justice. And the idea is, or the device is, imagine yourself in a hypothetical situation that wipes out all the particulars of your circumstance, of your desires, the so-called original position, the veil of ignorance, and design the arrangements among people so that they can disregard these particulars. What would you agree to in principle if you didn't know what your fortune in society would be? Those are the three main orientations. That's all I want to say about them now. They're described in greater detail in Parfit's text. Now, something remarkable has happened in the history of metaethics. You're going to read the text of one of the most influential of these metaethical thinkers, Parfit. What has happened is that they have, many of them, reluctantly come to the conclusion that these three supposedly incompatible positions are in fact equivalent. Parfit's metaphors are that they're ascent up the same mountain from different sides of the mountain. They're equivalent. Everything that can be claimed or proposed in one of them can be translated without much difficulty into the discourse of the other two. So they've had this struggle in the academy now for decades, and they've decided that it's really not about anything, or at least it's not about the differences among them. Now there are then three interpretations that are suggested here in the chart of this supposed equivalence. The first interpretation is the one argued by Parfit itself. They're equivalent because they're true. The three schools of academic philosophy have these three different views. Now we discovered that they can be translated into one another. That must show that they're all true. That's one interpretation of the equivalence. The second interpretation of the equivalence is that they're equivalent because they're empty. That's why it's so easy to translate them into one another. They don't actually require or command anything in the orientation of a real human life. they're infinitely elastic. If you were trained, for example, as a lawyer and you had half a brain, it wouldn't take you any time at all to make the same arguments and the same claim in these 3 different languages. It could be a school exercise. And then there's a third conjecture about their equivalence, which has an uncertain relation to the other 2 conjectures. The third conjecture is that they're equivalent because they all share a very particular approach to the moral life, which is the idea of the primacy, the supremacy of impartiality or universality or altruism. So on this idea, the fundamental problem in the human life is selfishness. Our experience of ourselves, of each of us, is that we're at the center of the world. And the task in the moral life is to overcome this self-centeredness and to view ourselves and treat ourselves as just one of many. And utilitarianism, Kantianism, and social contract are, on this conjecture, just 3 different ways of stating this particular view of the problem of the moral life. Now, this is not a self-evident view, because, for example, in Christianity, one could take the position as an interpretation of Christianity that a fundamental revolution brought about by Christianity and continued by Romanticism was the idea that altruism is not the highest form of moral experience. Altruism is inferior to love, and love is different from altruism. Love is a relation among equals who accept their reciprocal vulnerability, who require to be recognized by each other. It's not a one-sided gift from a distance and from above. And it's higher than altruism. It's more important. It has more transformative potential. Now, I mention that just to say that the primacy of altruism as the organizing principle of moral experience is not self-evident. And the proof that it's not self-evident is that it has been contested and denied in the history of our moral and spiritual ideas. But it is the unstated or unjustified common premise of these 3 meta-ethical propositions. So that's like 90% of academic moral philosophy in the English-speaking world, the contest among these 2 schools. 10% is what's left, moral casuistry. So there are 10 people in a lifeboat. The lifeboat is going to sink unless someone is thrown overboard. Who should you throw overboard? That's moral casuistry. It's the discussion of a series of fantastical moral dilemmas on which these general principles have almost no bearing. There's almost no relation between the meta-ethical schools and the moral casuistry. So the moral casuistry is like, again, an exercise, a fantasy, unrelated to the meta-ethical positions, but also having very little bearing on the question of how you'll orient your existence. So that's not what our course is about. But in the first part of the course, we intend to consider briefly the relation of what seems to be the real subject, the unstated subject in this academic moral philosophy, to what they do, and to this astonishing and disturbing discovery of the equivalence among the 3 meta-ethical schools. What does it mean? So what's the alternative to that as a subject matter? The alternative are what I'm calling here in the chart, the first-order projects. It's not about these higher-order methods, forms of argument. It's about the direction of human existence down below, And here in the chart, I've made a simple distinction of ancient and modern examples, mainly focused on the West. So in the ancient here are two moments. Here are two examples. One is what I'm calling here the Indo-European model, a paradigm studied by comparativists like the historian Dumézil. This Indo-European model, which we find present in many forms of ancient thought, in many societies and civilizations, ancient India, ancient Greece, Plato,
Republic.
the Republic, is that there is a hierarchy in the world. On one side, there is a social hierarchy, cosmically grounded in the constitution of ultimate reality. And on the other side, there's a hierarchy in the soul of our dispositions. And it is crucial that these two hierarchical orderings interact with each other and reinforce each other. So there are three main ranks in society. There's the rank of the priests and the thinkers, who are attuned to the spiritual and to ultimate reality. Then there's the rank of the fighters and the rulers. And finally, there's the rank of the workers, the farmers and husbandmen and technicians. That's the social hierarchy, which is grounded ultimately in the constitution of ultimate reality. And there is a parallel hierarchy in the soul. At the top, there's reason or spirit. Then there are the action-oriented impulses, vitality, courage. And at the bottom, there are the sensual appetites. And these three sets of dispositions must be hierarchically organized, the lower subordinate to the one above it, in order for there to be a peace in the soul. And the social cosmic hierarchy and the hierarchy in the soul depend on each other. That's this Indo-European paradigm, which, as Cornell just reminded us, is developed in the middle philosophy of Plato and in many civilizations around the world. Now, there's a second moment here, which I'm giving as an example, just to suggest how ancient thought had other approaches to the first-order projects. Aristotle, very close in the history of thought to Plato, who's Plato's student, his disciple, has a completely different view. The ancient eudaimonism, the classical virtue ethics, it dispenses with the idea of a cosmic order. And it grounds a conception of our moral life in a moral psychology against the background of an ontology, a philosophy of being. Every being has certain predispositions or potential and develops to that end, to that potential. And if we understand humanity in that light, we can see that there is a certain moral logic of humanity which will be the basis for the orientation to existence. Aristotle develops this in the Nicomachean Ethics with a conception of the virtues. The virtues are the habitual predispositions to action. And we favor always the middle ground. So courage, for example, is a middle term between cowardice and rashness. The magnanimous man, Aristotle's model, even in the way he walks in the street, walks neither too quickly nor too slowly. He walks with a stately, measured pace, self-possessed, fully serene, the master of his situation. This is the conception of human life which is presented there. Serenity is the reward for this lordship over oneself. So this is a world in which the idea of the cosmic order and its partnership with order in the soul has been abandoned, but there's nothing infinite. There's no conception of radical transformation in either society or the individual. Now we come to the characteristic modern first-order projects. Now here's a very interesting fact in trying to compose this chart. These are just examples. Now, but they're examples of the most important subject matter, the orientation to existence. So you think there'd be a vast established literature about the major orientations to existence, but there isn't. And the mere composition of a chart like this is a puzzle. It's strange. So I've just given some examples. So first order project is the Christian life. The Christian life, traditionally understood in the West as the imitation of Christ, of the life of Christ. And it seems that in Christianity and in its conception of the first order project, there are two great organizing themes. One theme is the theme of infinity. The individual shares in the life of God, in the life of the triune God. We are godlike. We don't share in the omniscience or omnipotence of God, but we share in his transcendence. We are more than what we seem to be. That's the infinity theme. And then there's the love theme. Love is higher than altruism. Love is different from altruism. Love is this radical vulnerability, acceptance of the other. The premise of the idea of love is that no one saves himself. Different from altruism. Altruism is this one-sided gift without danger. It can require sacrifice, but there's no intimate jeopardy of the self, unlike love. Now, although Christianity has been the dominant religion in the West, this is confused because the conventional conceptions of the Christian life are in fact largely altruistic. Christian charity, rather than focused on love. So the infinity theme is developed, but the love theme seems to be truncated in the development of our understanding of these first-order projects. Now comes a second family of first-order projects. I'm calling here Romanticism, which historically has a very close relation to Christianity. The individual has to manifest his infinity, his transcendence, through struggle against conformity and against society. And only through struggle can there be self-transformation and self-construction. That's the romantic view. And it is in violent contradiction to the ancient eudaimonism, because it denounces the ideal of serenity. It says, going back to my remark at the beginning of the class, no, don't stay out of trouble, look for trouble. Trouble is struggle, and struggle is the conditions for self-liberation and self-construction. Now here comes a third family of views. which in opposition to the idea of the supremacy of love over altruism, embraces a radical altruism. We should serve the collective ascent of mankind. We should be instruments of this rising up. And the theoreticians of this religion of humanity have been philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and Auguste Comte. But if you look at what they actually said and did, they seem to be ambivalent about their own religion of humanity. I was giving the example of Bentham having written in the dedication of a book to a lady in London society the following: the best way to be happy is to make other people happy. The best way to make other people happy is to pretend to love them. And the best way to pretend to love them is to love them in fact. So in only 2 moves, he jumped from Benthamism to Christianity. Some ambivalence about the religion of humanity, some confusion in the mind of the philosopher. Huh? Now then, we have this 4th idea here, that the road to our ascent is through this privatization of the sublime. We were just speaking of the privatization of the sublime in the religious context. The things that are most precious, deepest, our engagement with art or religion, with pleasure, are in the pianissimo of the personal life, not in the public. And that's the high point of life. And the sublime cannot take the public form. It cannot infuse collective life, either politically or doctrinally. It can exist only in the form of intimate experience. And the cultivation of these exemplary intimate experiences is the main goal in life. So there have been philosophers like G. Muir. The economist Keynes had this view, which was characteristic of his class or his faction in English society. And it is a view that remains attractive to a large part of the educated and disenchanted classes in the contemporary Western societies. And here I stated this 5th view. I've called here the paradise of fulfilled desire. There's a euphoria of desire. Fourier, Marcuse, the anti-Freud. Freud is sort of the reverse side of this. That's where we really live, where we're really human, in this euphoric moment of the satisfaction of desire in which we overthrow the repressive incubus of civilization. Now, look at the structure of this chart. So first of all, the difference between the ancient and the modern. These modern projects are in contest with each other. But in a sense, they have a common basis. One fundamental distinction between the ancient and the modern is the distinction between the finite and the infinite. So in a sense, these ancient projects are all what you could call finitistic. The modern ones are all premised on this idea of our infinity, that we're not contained by the roles or the cultures or the societies that we inhabit. There is more in us than there is in them. And that's the shared premise of all of these modern first-order projects. But there's a second premise, which is political rather than metaphysical or psychological. And that's the idea that there is no incontestable order of social life. that all the institutional arrangements of society that are established or that have been inherited are not an acceptable and definitive home for the human spirit. We are strangers in them. We are exiles in them. And we are then in a relationship of tension with the established organization of society. In all of these modern projects, there seems to be a complicated relationship between the theme of infinity or transcendence and the theme of the inadequacy of the established social form of human life. But they're all different. Now, so think of the problem that this chart presents to us. We want to discuss the orientations to existence. And it's not as if this subject hadn't been discussed in the history of our civilization. There are these thinkers, these schools of thought. But once we make them explicit, most of us would feel, how could anyone believe completely in this or that? Once they're expressed doctrinally as doctrines or projects, their incompleteness, their problematic character becomes manifest. So what do we do? So what's our response to this? Is our response that they all have somehow a side of the truth and we mix them together? Or we look for something else? Or we try to deal with the problem of the commitment of existence without formulating the issue and these general ideas? That's the problem. That's what this exercise reveals. The immense difficulty and confusion of the exercise that we have proposed.
But you know, there's three things I would add. You tell me what you think here. How are we doing with time?
We have time. We have 10 minutes or so.
And you tell me what you think. We got science, we got markets, and we got nationalism. And all three, in their very complicated ways, making this distinction, the ancient to the modern.
Yes.
The mathematicizing of knowledge, the new physics of Newton, and then on to Einstein. And the unbelievable way in that reshapes our understanding of what it is to have a first order moral project. Because no one can deny the unbelievable triumph in the shaping of our lived experience of science and technology. And it's almost, you can call it the kind of late triumph of Pythagoras. You remember Pythagoras said what? Number was at the center of reality. Well, if you ask the new physicists, it is about numbers. It is about mathematicizing. It's about quantifying. In fact, it's about quantifying to such a degree, you got to quantify in social science. They're trying to quantify novels now. They want to quantify poetry. You say, hold up, wait a minute. We accept the cell phones, but this is very real, because part of the connection of the religion of humanity was, can science generate a first order morality, a first order moral project, given the unbelievable authority of science that proves itself over and over and over again? Then you've got the most powerful ideology in the modern world, which is the nation state and nationalism. And what is that? It's a militarizing too, because what is the distinctive feature of the nation state is not just that it has a monopoly on the institutions of administration for public resources and public life, but it has a monopoly on instrumentalities of violence. And you see the escalation of militarized nation states in which what? In which people are, and this is a distinctive feature of a first order moral project, which is what? Are you willing to die for it? If you're not willing to die for it, it's just chit-chat. Like
but Cornell, what then is the relation of nationalism to the contest of these projects?
Well, but these all together, you got the science,
yes.
And you've got markets. I don't want to downplay markets and capitalism commodification. So you got nationalization, militarized. You got commodification,
Yes.
penetrating every nook and cranny. Then you've got science in its triumph. What space is left for these particular alternatives and options on the ground that can actually have rootage and anchorage in the hearts and minds?
Well, let me then make an argument
Sure,
with
come back.
respect to nationalism.
Sure,
because,
sure.
Because it's true that each of these subjects you propose suggests another perspective
Yes,
on our
yes.
on our subject matter.
Yes.
So, what is the distinctive character of modern nationalism? For the ancient Romans, to be a Roman was to live according to the customs of the Romans. Mm-hmm. In other words, the collective identity is concrete. It is equated with a set of customary forms of life.
Yes, yes.
Distinctive character of modern nationalism is that there's a worldwide struggle of emulation, ideological and economic, among the nation states. And in order to survive and prosper in this struggle, they must give up parts of themselves. That is to say, they must sacrifice some of their customs. They must look around the world and cannibalize the things that are tried out in every other part of the world and recombine them. So the collective identities then become eviscerated. They become abstract. Mm-hmm. And we have now in the world a will to difference that is aroused or inflamed by the waning of actual difference. So two nations live side by side, and they hate each other, not because they are different, but because they are becoming alike, and because they want to be different. So the will to difference is poisonous insofar as it is eviscerated. That is, if there are concrete identities, the concrete identities are porous and subject to compromise. But if the concrete identities, if the national identities are eviscerated of content, and they are simply a will to the assertion of difference, they become the object of an intransigent political will. That's what we have in the world. And so then there are two solutions to that problem. One solution is the solution of liberal cosmopolitanism, which is simply to suppress the will to difference. Mm-hmm. And to establish a universal regime in the world under the command of the great powers. And the other solution is to equip the will to difference with instruments for the creation of actual difference, so that the nations of the world can become different, so that they can make themselves different. And their difference will be the less dangerous, the more tangible and empowered it is. It is dangerous because it is empty. So on that view, the phenomenon of nationalism in its characteristic modern form actually flows into these debates about the project. What kind of life do we want? Can we somehow evade the debate about the project of human existence by thinking of ourselves, of each nation, as a tribe whose project it is simply to reconstitute in the future its inherited form of life? That's what's impossible. And the real nationalism in the world, and its peculiarly dangerous character, is the one that arises in the aftermath of the waning of these actual differences. So I think we could have a similar argument about each of the themes that you propose as a perspective, that they're not really ways of escaping this debate. On the contrary, each of them leads back into the same debate. And we have to find a way to have this debate. That's the problem. We don't have this debate. So I put here on the chart this comparison of orientations to existence, and I ask you, where does this debate exist? What is its discursive or disciplinary form? It doesn't exist. And it seems like it would have to be the most fundamental debate but we don't actually have it. And that's, I think that's the basic motivation of this effort that we're making here.
But you see, I think I was introducing these three factors, which are fundamental intellectual, social, individual factors in shaping the lived experience, as in part ways that lead for the displacement or the subordination of these particular projects.
No, I understand that. That's what I argued with respect to nationalism, that it doesn't serve as an evasion of these debates, that only on a misunderstanding of them. Because once we go into the content, we see that we're brought back to the same debate.
No, because one, let's just look briefly at the genealogy of these things. These emerge as collective attempts to bring some indictment to empire and some space to push the empires out, like the founding United States. Right? So that the emergence of it is very clear what the difference is. We are New Englanders. George III kissed my so-and-so. Culturally, religiously, you're still deeply European, you're still deeply English, but we are U.S.ers over against the British Empire. That difference is very clear, very clear. Now, it's also tied, as we know, to capitalist markets that are emerging. Right? It's also tied to the tremendous impact of science. And the question then becomes, in complicating the legacies of each one of these three, how does it relate to these forces, and whether, in fact, there's any space left when you get beyond nationalism, commodification, and deferring to the unbelievable triumphs of science? It could be. I mean, if commodification is ubiquitous the way Lukács projected it would be, then there's not going to be any substantive debate about the good life. All you got to do is turn on TV, and it tells you what it is. And even if you think it's Christian, it's just commodified Christianity. You think it's Judaism, and it ain't got nothing to do with Amos. It's commodified Judaism. You think, so that, I mean, that's a very, very bleak view. But there's some truth in it, I think. But the point is, how then do we think about this in relation to these forces? And I think the points that you made were very powerful ones in terms of the differences that can often be cast as empty, that become even a stronger will to difference, and so forth. But we've got some questions and answers before we go. Don't hesitate.
I wonder about the difference. I wonder if we've solved the differences between your two articulations of nationalism, right? So Professor Unger says that there's a nationalism that is sort of largely empty, right? And its danger is in that very emptiness, such that really in the age of globalization and, you know, the pervasiveness of commercialism and what have you, we're all sort of more similar than different. And the danger in this nationalism is that it's more about our will to difference than it is about an actual difference. And then you, Professor West, give us this example of New Englanders, right? And I think to myself, well, yeah, but you just said we're mostly the same, right, culturally, and in all these other ways. So is that not an example that Professor Unger could use to say, yeah, well, the danger in that is that this difference is more about us desiring difference than it is about an actual difference? And then how does that, so is the space between you really resolved in that example?
I think that one way to moderate the divergence, if there is a divergence between us, has to do with the respective roles of the past and the future. So we have the differences that we inherit, and then we have the differences that we create. And we, of course, have to create the future differences with the material of the past differences. But on this view, on this characterization of the situation that I defended, the future matters more than the past. And the inherited material is dissolving. Prophecy matters more than memory. And the modern nationalism is more dangerous and more promising because it's properly understood to be about the future more than it is about the past. And that's then the question. What is the direction? What is the role of the different nations of the world in a world of democracies, of free societies? The fundamental idea is there's no natural form of social life. Therefore, humanity can develop its powers and possibilities only by developing them in different directions. So the national distinction in the world has as its legitimate basis a kind of moral specialization within humanity. That's why we should want to have different nations.
No,
so
no,
that we
see,
could
this is the difference.
Experiment.
This is the difference. Let me just put this up here before we got to go. Something called the military. People need protection. They have profound fears for protection. The fundamental role of the nation state is not moral specialization. It's to protect folk with their military.
Yes. So these different
is also escalating, especially these neo-fascist days. That's escalating because the fear is overwhelming and you want some military protection. The difference between New England and England was the military was repressing and de-representing us, or repressing us and not allowing our voices to be heard. So we can have the same breakfast in Boston and London, but the troops got to go. The British troops got to go. That's very important. Go right ahead.
Bring us to number 3 under features of philosophical and theological discourse, wherein we're grappling with is versus ought, right? Because you can say that, listen, the reality today is that we need the military because people need to feel safe, and that is the situation.
We've always had.
Get to an ought of the reality.
Oh, I'm headed where Brother Roberto's headed.
I mean,
I'm headed where he's headed.
You know, Cornell may disagree with me, but I don't disagree with him because it's the same. There is this moral specialization of humanity. These different forms of life that we have to build.
That's
the only way of building humanity. They have to be protected. So this is the tragic aspect of the national difference.
That's right.
And particularly because what happens in the world now is that only the meek are unarmed. So the belligerent powers are armed to the teeth.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
So the most peaceful countries would have to arm themselves so that we not live in a world in which only the meek are unarmed. Yeah. And that is this problem then of global governance in a world which can develop only by developing in different directions under the shield of the power of these armed states. So there's no disagreement about that and about the dangers inherent in that.
That's true. I just wanted to emphasize that military side, not just the moral side. And my brother accepts that. He embraces that. But we're headed in the same direction. But I mean, these are part of the complications of the kind of conversation that we want to have in regard to these first-order moral projects.
Our time is up.
Time is up. So next week we start with Parker.
Yeah.